Hello everyone, welcome back on Meds. I am your host Mr. Meds aka King Meds and Kambi Niboti Aaaah Zaneyeza. So today's video is just gonna be a continuation of our previous video. So in our previous video we discussed the scope of practice of a pharmacist and a qualified post-basic pharmacist assistant, QPB. Today we're gonna discuss this, we're gonna continue where we left. I want to start with the scope of practice of a basic assistant, learner basic pharmacist assistant, and a learner post-basic pharmacist assistant. Then we will continue discuss the scope of practice of a student pharmacist, then a pharmacist intern, and a community service pharmacist. So as I mentioned before, a pharmacist assistant goes through a 2-year training course. Then after completing the 2-year training course, they qualify to register as qualified post-basic pharmacist assistant. So based on the pre-approved curriculum, each year they are allowed to register under a certain scope of practice. On their first year of training, they register as learner basic assistant, then basic assistant after completing their first year. On their second year, then they become learner post-basic pharmacist assistant. Then after completing their second and final year, they become qualified post-basic pharmacist assistant. After completing first year, assistant can choose to remain and practice as a basic pharmacist assistant, or they can do second year. On their second year of training, they are called learner post-basic pharmacist assistant. Then after completing their second year, then they are qualified post-basic pharmacist assistant. Now let's quickly discuss the scope of practice of a learner basic and a basic pharmacist assistant. The curriculum of a pharmacist assistant is more practical than theory. That means they spend more time in pharmacy doing the work than in classroom. So the scope of practice is very important to them as to act as a guide on how to operate within acceptable boundaries in the dispensary. So we will discuss the scope of practice of a basic pharmacist assistant. This is according to Regulation 9 of the Regulations of the Pharmacy Act. Basic pharmacist assistant are allowed to sell Schedule 1 substances and schedule substances. I want you to notice the difference between the scope of practice of a basic and a post-basic pharmacist assistant. I will tell you as we go on. So they are allowed to sell Schedule 1 substances, while post-basic pharmacist assistants are allowed to sell Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances. Basic pharmacist assistant can assist with compounding, manipulating, or preparing of non-sterile Schedule 1 up to 4 under a direct supervision of a pharmacist. They are allowed to assist with manufacturing of non-sterile medicine or scheduled substances. So the post-basic can do sterile and non-sterile, can help with preparation and manufacturing of sterile and non-sterile medicine up to Schedule 5. So that means the post-basic have a wider scope of practice than the basic assistant. So the difference between sterile and non-sterile is that a non-sterile product are products that contain acceptable levels of microorganisms. For example, topical preparations, which is your cream and ointments, while oral preparation, your syrup, tablets, and capsules. Then your suppositories and pessary as well. Then sterile preparations are preparations that have to be prepared under extremely clean environment and should be free from microorganisms. So these are your injections, your eye drop, intravenous solution, and others. So basic assistant, they can help with distribution and control of stock of scheduled substances up to Schedule 5. Post-basic can do up to Schedule 6. They can help with repackaging of medicine into appropriate containers. They are allowed to participate in health promotion, general housekeeping, and administrative tasks. So this means they can help with packing orders, ordering stock, capturing stock, and filing prescriptions. So out of this I've mentioned above, the basic assistant have to work under a direct supervision of a pharmacist. Basic assistants are not allowed to dispense scripts, so that's the reason why you barely see them in practice, because their scope of practice is very limited. So they are not allowed to dispense scripts, they can't counsel customers regarding medications, so there is just too much restrictions on them. Okay, so we've discussed the scope of practice of a basic assistant. Now the learner basic assistant. So learner basic assistants are allowed to practice under a scope of practice of a basic assistant for purpose of education and training under a direct supervision of a pharmacist. So it's basically the same thing. Now I want you to notice how the names of assistants indicate their qualification level. So basic pharmacist assistant are those that have completed their first year, and post-basic pharmacist assistants are those that have completed their second year. If there is a learner in front of their name, it means that they are still student, and the name after is the name of the qualification they are studying towards. Then learner post-basic pharmacist assistants is allowed to practice fully under a scope of practice of a basic assistant, but for purpose of education and training they are allowed to practice under a scope of practice of a qualified post-basic pharmacist assistant under a direct supervision of a pharmacist. Now I've already went through the scope of practice of a qualified post-basic pharmacist assistant on my previous video. Now let's discuss the scope of practice of a student pharmacist, an intern, and then a community service pharmacist. So in order for you to qualify as a pharmacist, you need to complete a 4-year degree, so that is Bachelor of Pharmacy. It must be from one of the approved universities, which are University of Western Cape, UWC, University of KwaZulu-Natal, UKZN, Rhodes University, Nelson Mandela University, University of Northwest, University of Limpopo, Tshwane University of Technology, Sefako Makgato University, or you can complete a BSc in Pharmacology with honors at Wits University. If any other institution except these ones is offering the qualification, it's fraud, because only these institutions are currently registered and approved by the South African Pharmacy Council. So during a 4-year training, pharmacy students are allowed to practice under various scope of practice of pharmacy personnel. So a pharmacy student is allowed to practice under a scope of practice of a basic pharmacist assistant after completing their first year. Then after completing their second year, they are allowed to practice under a scope of practice of a qualified post-basic pharmacist assistant. Then after completing their third year, they are allowed to practice under a scope of practice of a pharmacy technician. Now we will discuss the scope of practice of a pharmacy technician on our next video. During their course of study, the student pharmacist may be allowed to practice under a scope of practice of a pharmacist for purposes of education and training under a direct supervision of a pharmacist. If you happen to not complete your pharmacy qualification, you are not allowed to practice as a pharmacist assistant unless you complete the relevant certificate. So now let's say you drop out of second year, and then you think you're gonna be practicing as a basic pharmacist assistant. No, you are not allowed. Or maybe let's say you drop out in third year, you think maybe you're gonna be a qualified post-basic pharmacist assistant. That is not allowed. You have to go and start afresh the qualification of a pharmacist assistant. Then after completing the 4-year degree, you qualify as a pharmacist intern. You are allowed to do internship at any institution or sector as long as it is registered and approved by Pharmacy Council. During the 1-year training, pharmacist intern is allowed to practice under a scope of practice of a pharmacist assistant. It can be any depending on the knowledge level of the intern, or pharmacist technician. For purpose of education and training, they may work under a scope of practice of a qualified pharmacist under direct supervision of a pharmacist. Now, the community service pharmacist. So after completing your internship, you have to pay back government their time or hours. So after completing your internship, you are allocated at an institution approved by government. It's usually public institution, but if there is no sufficient space available, they can allocate you in a private institution like your retail, your Clicks, your Discam, or you can go into a private hospital. During this period, a community service pharmacist is allowed to practice under a scope of practice of a pharmacist without any supervision. So the community service pharmacists are basically pharmacists, but the only restriction they have is that they are not allowed to work anywhere else other than institution that they are registered or assigned to. So that means you can't do any locums or any other things except on that institution. So using my skills, so I decided to create this diagram. So this is just going to be a summary of what I've already spoke about. So as you see, there is a student pharmacist, year 2, year 3, and year 4. And then after finishing your qualification, you become a pharmacist intern. After pharmacist intern, you become a community service pharmacist. After becoming a community service pharmacist, you become a pharmacist. Then on the other side of the chart, there is a learner basic pharmacist assistant, which is the first year. After completing the first year, you become a basic pharmacist assistant. If you want to, you can become a learner. I can continue doing a second year and become a learner post basic pharmacist assistant. Then after you're done with being a learner post basic pharmacist assistant, then you can if you finish your qualification, then you can be a qualified post basic pharmacist assistant. And as it shows on the graph with the green lines, that's a scope of practice. So a third year student can practice under a scope of practice of a qualified post basic pharmacist assistant. Then a second year student can practice under a scope of practice of a basic pharmacist assistant. And then when it comes to supervision, the pharmacist, you see the dotted lines, the pharmacist has to supervise basically all the assistant, and then a pharmacist intern and a student pharmacist. So that is just a summary of what we've covered so far. But then our next video we'll see whether pharmacy technician fit on this graph. So we'll see. But as I said on the video, the fourth year students are allowed to practice under a scope of practice of a pharmacy technician. So we'll discuss the pharmacy technician on next video and see where it fits on this graph. Okay, now we've discussed most of the pharmacy personnel in the dispensary, but you might find one more personnel in the dispensary. So that is the responsible pharmacist. So responsible pharmacists, also known as dispensary managers, they are basically pharmacists. So they are practice under the same scope of practice as a pharmacist, so the qualified pharmacist. But their job is just basically they are responsible for running the dispensary and making sure that the pharmacy or the dispensary meet their acceptable requirements or the acceptable standards. Okay, so that's it for today. So our next video I will be discussing the scope of practice of a pharmacy technician. This is quite a new addition to a pharmacy personnel, so most of the people don't really understand it well. So in our next video we'll try to analyze it and see where it fits in the dispensary. So for now, stay on meds for more clarity, not confusion, 1 minute at a time. See you on the next one.